Livy. Book 1. Rome under the Kings, 753 to 510 BC. The task of writing a history of our nation from Rome's earliest days fills me, I confess, with some misgiving, and even were I confident in the value of my work, I should hesitate to say so. I am aware that for historians to make extravagant claims is, and always has been, all too common. Every writer on history tends to look down his nose at his less cultivated predecessors, happily persuaded that he will better them in point of style, or bring new facts to light. But however that may be, I shall find satisfaction in contributing, not, I hope, ignobly, to the labor of putting on record the story of the greatest nation in the world. Countless others have written on this theme, and it may be that I shall pass unnoticed amongst them. If so, I must comfort myself with the greatness and splendor of my rivals, whose work will rob my own of recognition. My task, moreover, is an immensely laborious one. I shall have to go back more than 700 years and trace my story from its small beginnings up to these recent times, when its ramifications are so vast that any adequate treatment is hardly possible. I am aware, too, that most readers will take less pleasure in my account of how Rome began and in her early history. They will wish to hurry on to more modern times and to read of the period, already a long one, in which the might of an imperial people is beginning to work its own ruin. My own feeling is different. I shall find antiquity a rewarding study, if only because, while I'm absorbed in it, I shall be able to turn my eyes from the troubles which for so long have tormented the modern world, and to write without any of that over-anxious consideration which may well plague a writer on contemporary life, even if it does not lead him to conceal the truth. Events before Rome was born or thought of have come to us in old tales with more of the charm of poetry than of a sound historical record. And such traditions I propose neither to affirm nor refute. There is no reason, I feel, to object when antiquity draws no hard line between the human and the supernatural. It adds dignity to the past, and if any nation deserves the privilege of claiming a divine ancestry, that nation is our own. And so great is the glory won by the Roman people in their wars that, when they declare that Mars himself was their first parent and father of the man who founded their city, all the nations of the world might well allow the claim as readily as they accept Rome's imperial dominion. These, however, are comparatively trivial matters, and I set little store by them. I invite the reader's attention to the much more serious consideration of the kind of lives our ancestors lived, of who were the men, and what the means both in politics and war by which Rome's power was first acquired and subsequently expanded. I would then have him trace the process of our moral decline, to watch first the sinking of the foundations of morality as the old teachings was allowed to lapse, then the rapidly increasing disintegration, then the final collapse of the whole edifice, and the dark dawning of our modern day, when we can neither endure our vices nor face the remedies needed to cure them. The study of history is the best medicine for a sick mind, for in history you have a record of the infinite variety of human experience, plainly set out for all to see, and in that record you can find for yourself and your country both examples and warnings. Fine things to take as models, base things, rotten through and through, to avoid. I hope my passion for Rome's past has not impaired my judgment, for I do honestly believe that no country has ever been greater or purer than ours, or richer in good citizens and noble deeds. None has been free for so many generations from the vices of avarice and luxury. Nowhere have thrift and plain living been for so long held in such esteem. Indeed, poverty with us went hand in hand with contentment. Of late years, wealth has made us greedy, and self-indulgence has brought us, through every form of sensual excess, to be, if I may put it, in love with death, both individual and collective. But bitter comments of this sort are not likely to find favor, even when they have to be made. Let us have no more of them, at least at the beginning of our great story. On the contrary, I should prefer to borrow from the poets and begin with good omens and with prayers to all the hosts of heaven to grant a successful issue to the work which lies before me. It is generally accepted that after the fall of Troy, the Greeks kept up hostilities against all the Trojans except Aeneas and Antenor. These two men had worked consistently for peace and the restoration of Helen, and for that reason, added to certain personal connections of long standing, they were allowed to go unmolested. Each had various adventures. Antenor joined forces with the Aneti, who had been driven out of Paphlagonia, and having lost their king, Pylaemenes, at Troy, wanted someone to lead them as well as somewhere to settle. He penetrated to the head of the Adriatic and expelled the Eugaei, a tribe living between the Alps and the sea, and occupied that territory with a mixed population of Trojans and the Anati. The spot where they landed is called Troy, and the neighboring country the Trojan district. The combined peoples came to be known as the Venetians. Aeneas was forced into exile by similar troubles. He, however, was destined to lay the foundations of a greater future. He went first to Macedonia, then, in his search for a new home, sailed to Sicily, and from Sicily to the territory of Laurentum. This part of Italy, too, like the spot where Antenor landed, is known as Troy. Aeneas's men, in the course of their almost interminable wanderings, had lost all they possessed except their ships and their swords. Once on shore, they set about scouring the countryside for what they could find, and while thus engaged, they were met by a force of armed natives who, under their king, Latinus, came hurrying up from the town and the surrounding country to protect themselves from the invaders. There are two versions of what happened next. According to one, there was a fight in which Latinus was beaten. He then came to terms with Aeneas and cemented the alliance by giving him his daughter in marriage. According to the other, the battle was about to begin when Latinus, before the trumpets could sound the charge, came forward with his captains and invited the foreign leader to a parley. He then asked Aeneas who his men were and where they had come from, why they had left their homes, and what was their object in landing on Laurentian territory. He was told in reply that the men were Trojans, their leader Aeneas, the son of Anchises and Venus, that their native town had been burnt to the ground, and now they were fugitives in search of some place where they could build a new town to settle in. Latinus, hearing their story, was so deeply impressed by the noble bearing of the strangers, that by their leader's high courage either for peace or war, that he gave Aeneas his hand in pledge of friendship. From that moment onward, a treaty was made, the two armies exchanged signs of mutual respect. Aeneas accepted the hospitality of Latinus, who gave him his daughter in marriage, thus further confirming the treaty of alliance by a private and domestic bond solemnly entered into the presence of the gods of his hearth. The Trojans could no longer doubt that at last their travels were over, and that they had found a permanent home. They began to build a settlement, which Aeneas named Lavinium, after his wife Lavinia. A child was soon born of the marriage, a boy who was given the name Ascanius, or Ascanius. The Trojans and the Latins were soon jointly involved in war. Turnus, prince of the Rutuli, to whom Latinus's daughter, Lavinia, had been pledged before Aeneas' arrival, angered by the insult of having to step down in favor of the stranger, attacked the combined forces of Aeneas and Latinus. Both sides suffered in the subsequent struggle. The Rutuli were defeated, but the victors lost their leader, Latinus. Turnus and his people, in their anxiety for the future, then looked for help to Mezentius, king of the rich and powerful Etruscans, whose seat of government was at Caere. At that time a wealthy town. Mezentius needed little persuasion to join the Rutuli, as from the outset he had been far from pleased by the rise of the new settlement, and now felt that the Trojan power was growing much more rapidly than was safe for its neighbors. In this dangerous situation, Aeneas conferred the native name of Latins upon his own people. The sharing of a common name as well as a common polity would, he felt, strengthen the bond between the two peoples. As a result of this step, the original settlers were no less loyal to their king. Aeneas, then, were the Trojans themselves. Trojans and Latins were rapidly becoming one people, and gave Aeneas confidence to make an active move against the Etruscans, in spite of their great strength. Etruria, indeed, had at this time, both by sea and land, filled the whole length of Italy, from the Alps to the Sicilian Strait, with the noise of her name. Nonetheless, Aeneas refused to act on the defensive, and marched out to meet the enemy. The Latins were victorious, and for Aeneas the battle was the last of his labors in this world. He lies buried on the river Numicus. Was he man or god? However it be, men call him Jupiter indignes. the local Jove. Aeneas's son, Ascanius, was still too young for a position of authority. Lavinia, however, was a woman of great character and acted as regent until Ascanius came of age and was able to assume power as the successor of his father and grandfather. There is some doubt, and no one can pretend to certainty on something so deeply buried in the midst of time, about who precisely this Ascanius was. Was it the one I have been discussing, or was it an elder brother, the son of Creusa, who was born before the sack of Troy, and was with Aeneas in his escape from the burning city? The Iulus, in fact, whom the Julian family claim as their eponym. It is at any rate certain that Aeneas was his father, and whatever the answer to the other question may be, it can be taken as a fact that he left Lavinium to found a new settlement. Lavinium was by then a populous and, for those days, a rich and flourishing town, and Ascanius left it in charge of his mother, or stepmother, if you will, and went off to found his new settlement on the Alban hills. This town, strung out as it was along a ridge, was named Alba Longa. Its foundation took place about 30 years after that of Lavinium, but the Latins had already grown so strong, especially since the defeat of the Etruscans, that neither Mezentius, the Etruscan king, nor any other neighboring people dared to attack them, even when Aeneas died, and the control of things passed temporarily into the hands of a woman, and Ascanius was still a child, learning the elements of kingship. By the terms of the treaty between the Latins and Etruscans, the river Albula, now the Tiber, became the boundary between the two territories. Ascanius was succeeded by his son Silvius, born in the woods, and he by his son Aeneas Silvius, whose heir was Latinus Silvius. By him several new settlements were made, and given the name of Old Latins. All the kings of Alba subsequently kept the cognomen Silvius. Next in succession to Latinus was Alba, then Attis, then Capes, then Capitus, then Tiberinus, who was drowned crossing the Albula, and gave the river the name by which succeeding generations have always known it. Tiberinus was succeeded by Agrippa, Agrippa by his son Romulus Silvius, who was struck by lightning and bequeathed his power to Aventinus. Aventinus was buried on the hill, now a part of the city of Rome, and still bearing his name. Procca, the next king, had two sons, Numitor and Amulius, to the elder of whom, Numitor, he left the hereditary realm of the Silvian family. That, at last, was his intention, but respect for seniority was flouted, the father's will ignored, and Amulius drove out his brother and seized the throne. One act of violence led to another. He proceeded to murder his brother's male children, and made his niece, Rhea Silvia, a vestal, ostensibly to do her honor, but actually by condemning her to perpetual virginity to preclude the possibility of issue. But I must believe it was already written in the book of fate that this great city of ours should arise, and the first steps be taken to the founding of the mightiest empire the world has known, next to God's. The Vestal Virgin was raped and gave birth to twin boys. Mars, she declared, was their father. Perhaps she believed it. Perhaps she was merely hoping by the pretense to palliate her guilt. Whatever the truth of the matter, neither gods nor men could save her or her babes from the savage hands of the king. The mother was bound and flung into prison. The boys, by the king's order, were condemned to be drowned in the river. Destiny, however, intervened. The Tiber had overflowed its banks. Because of the flooded ground, it was impossible to get to the actual river, and the men entrusted to do the deed thought that the flood water, sluggish though it was, would serve their purpose. Accordingly, they made shift to carry out the king's orders by leaving the infants on the edge of the first floodwater they came to, at the spot where now stands the ruminal fig tree, said to have once been known as the fig tree of Romulus. In those days the country thereabouts was all wild and uncultivated, and the story goes that when the basket in which the infants had been exposed was left high and dry by the receding water, a she-wolf, coming down from the neighboring hills to quench her thirst, heard the children crying, and made her way to where they were. She offered them her tears to suck, and treated them with such gentleness that Faustulus, the king's herdsman, found her licking them with her tongue. Faustulus took them to his hut, and gave them to his wife Laurentia to nurse. Some think that the origin of this fable was the fact that Laurentia was a common whore, and was called Wolf by the shepherds. Such then was the birth and upbringing of the twins. By the time they were grown boys, they employed themselves actively on the farm and with the flocks, and began to go hunting in the woods. Their strength grew with their resolution, until, not content only with the chase, they took their attacking robbers, and sharing their stolen goods with their friends, the shepherds, other young fellows joined them, and they and the shepherds would fleet the time together. Now in serious talk, now in jollity. Even in that remote age, the Palatine Hill, which got its name from the Arcadian settlement, Palentium, is supposed to have been the scene of the great gay festival of the Lupercalia, the Arcadian Evander, who many years before held that region, is said to have instituted there the old Arcadian practice of holding an annual festival in honor of Lycian Pan, afterwards called Inuus by the Romans, in which young men ran about naked and disported themselves in various pranks and fooleries. The day of the festival was common knowledge, and on one occasion, when it was in full swing, some brigands, incensed at the loss of their ill-gotten gains, laid a trap for Romulus and Remus. Romulus successfully defended himself, but Remus was caught and handed over to Amulius. The brigands laid a complaint against their prisoner, the main charge being that he and his brother were in the habit of raiding Numitor's land with an organized gang of ruffians and stealing the cattle. Thereupon Remus was handed over for punishment to Numitor. Now, Faustulus had suspected all along that the boys he was bringing up were of royal blood. He knew that 2 infants had been exposed by the king's orders, and the rescue of his own 2 fitted perfectly in point of time. Hitherto, however, he had been unwilling to declare what he knew, until either a suitable opportunity occurred, or circumstances compelled him. Now the truth could no longer be concealed. So in his alarm he told Romulus the whole story. Numitor, too, when he had Remus in custody, and was told that the brothers were twins, was set thinking about his grandsons. The young men's age and character, so different from the lowly born, confirmed his suspicions, and further inquiries led him to the same conclusion, until he was on the point of acknowledging Remus. The net was closing in, and Romulus acted. He was not strong enough for open hostilities, so he instructed a number of the herdsmen to meet at the king's house by different routes at a preordained time. This was done, and with the help of Remus, at the head of another body of men, the king was surprised and killed. Before the first blows were struck, Numitor gave it out that the enemy had broken into the town and attacked the palace. He then threw off all the men of military age to garrison an inner fortress, and as soon as he saw Romulus and Remus, their purpose accomplished, coming to congratulate him, he summoned a meeting of the people and laid the facts before it. Amulius's crime against himself, the birth of his grandsons, and the circumstances attending it, how they were brought up and ultimately recognized, and finally the murder of the king, for which he himself assumed responsibility. The 2 brothers marched through the crowd at the head of their men, and saluted their grandfather as king, and by a shout of unanimous consent, his royal title was confirmed. Romulus and Remus, after the control of Alba had passed to Numitor, in the way I have described, were suddenly seized by an urge to found a new settlement on the spot where they had been left to drown as infants, and had been subsequently brought up. There was, in point of fact, already an excess of population at Alba. What with the Albans themselves, the Latins, and the addition of the herdsmen, enough indeed to justify the hope that Alba and Lavinium would one day be small places compared with the proposed new settlement. Unhappily, the brothers' plans for the future were marred by the same curse, which had divided their grandfather and Amulius, jealousy and ambition. A disgraceful quarrel arose from a matter in itself trivial. As the brothers were twins, and all question of seniority was thereby precluded, they determined to ask the tutelary gods of the countryside to declare by augury which of them should govern the new town once it was founded, and give his name to it. For his purpose Romulus took the Palatine Hill, and Remus the Aventine, as their respective stations, from which to observe the auspices. Remus, the story goes, was the first to receive a sign, 6 vultures, and no sooner was this made known to the people than double the number in birds appeared to Romulus. The followers of each promptly saluted their master as king, one side basing its claim upon priority, the other upon number. Angry words ensued, followed by too soon by blows, and in the course of the affray Remus was killed. There is another story, a commoner one, according to which Remus was, by way of jeering at his brother, jumped over the half-built walls of the new settlement, whereupon Romulus killed him in a fit of rage, adding the threat, "So perish whoever else shall overleap my battlements." This, then, was how Romulus obtained the sole power. The newly built city was called by its founder's name. Romulus's first act was to fortify the Palatine, the scene of his own upbringing. He offered sacrifice to the gods using the Alban forms, except in the case of Hercules, where he followed the Greek ritual as instituted by Evander. According to the old tale, Hercules, after killing Geryon, came into these parts driving his oxen. The oxen were exceedingly beautiful, and close to the Tiber, at the spot where he had swum across. With them he came upon a grassy meadow. Here, weary with walking, he lay down to rest and allowed the beasts to refresh themselves with the rich pasture. Being drowsy with food and drink, he fell asleep, and while he slept, a shepherd of that region, a fierce giant named Cacus, saw the oxen and was instantly taken by their beauty. Purposing to steal them, he was aware that if he drove them in the ordinary way into his cave, their tracks would not fail to guide their master thither as soon as he began his search. So, choosing the finest from the herd, he dragged them backwards by their tails and hid them in his caravan. Hercules awoke at dawn, and casting his eye over the herd, noticed that some of the animals were missing. He went at once to the nearest cave on the chance that there were tracks leading into it, but found that they all led outwards, apparently to nowhere. It was very old. So full of vague misgivings, he started driving the remainder of his herd away from this entire eerie spot. Some of the beasts, naturally enough, missed their companions and began to low, and there came an answering low from the cave. Hercules turned. He walked toward the cave, and Cacus, when he saw him coming, tried to keep him off, but all in vain. Hercules struck him with his club, and the robber, vainly calling upon his friends for help, fell dead. In those days Evander held sway over that part of the country. He was an exile from the Peloponnese, and his position depended less upon sovereign power than upon personal influence. He was revered for his invention of letters, a strange and wonderful thing to the rude, uncultivated men amongst whom he dwelt, and still more on account of his mother Carmenta, who was supposed to be divine, and before the coming of the Sibyl into Italy had been revered by the people of those parts as a prophetess.
On the occasion of which I am writing, Evander could not but observe the shepherds who were excitedly mobbing the unknown killer. He joined them, and upon being informed of the crime and its cause, directed his gaze upon the stranger. Seeing him to be of more than human stature and of a preternatural dignity of bearing, he asked him who he was, and hearing his name and parentage, the country cried, "Hercules, son of Jupiter, I bid you welcome. You are the subject of my mother's prophecy, for she, a true prophet, declared that you would increase the number of the gods, and that here an altar would be dedicated to you, and the nation, destined to be the mightiest in the world, would one day name its greatest of altars, and serve it with your own proper rites." Hercules gave him his hand, and replied that he accepted the inspired words, and would himself assist the course of destiny by building and consecrating an altar. A splendid beast was chosen from the herd, and on the new altar sacrifice. For this first time the offered was offered to Hercules, the rite itself, and the subsequent feast being administered by members of the two most distinguished local families, the Potitae and Pinarii. It so happened that the Pinarii were late for the feast. The Potitae were there in time, and were served in consequence with the entrails of the victim, and the Pinarii came in only for the remainder. From this circumstance, the custom became established that no member of the Pinarian family, throughout its history, was ever served with his portion of entrails at a sacrifice to Hercules. The Potitae were taught by Evander, and furnished the priest of the cult for many generations, until the solemn duty they had so long performed was delegated to public slaves, and the family became extinct. This was the only foreign religious rite adopted by Romulus. By so doing, he showed even then his respect for that immortality which is the prize of valor. His own destiny was already leading him to the same reward. Having performed with proper ceremony his religious duties, he summoned his subjects and gave them laws, without which the creation of a unified body politic would not have been possible. In his view, the rabble over whom he ruled could be induced to respect the law only if he himself adopted certain visible signs of power. He proceeded, therefore, to increase the dignity and impressiveness of his position by various devices, of which the most important was the creation of the 12 lictors to attend his person. Some have fancied that he made the lictors 12 in number, because the vultures in the augury had been 12. Personally, however, I incline to follow the opinion which finds for this an Etruscan origin. We know that the state chair, the curule chair, and the purple-bordered toga came to us from Etruria, and it is probable that the idea of attendance as well as, in this case, of their number came across the border from Etruria too. The number 12 was due to the fact that the 12 Etruscan communities united to elect a king, and each contributed 1 lictor. Meanwhile, Rome was growing. More and more ground was coming within the circuit of its walls. Indeed, the rapid expansion of the enclosed area was out of proportion to the actual population, and evidently indicating an eye to the future. In antiquity, the founder of a new settlement, in order to increase its population, would, as a matter of course, shart up a lot of homeless and destitute folk, and pretend that they were born of earth, to be his progeny. Romulus now followed a similar course. To help fill his big new town, he threw open in the ground, now enclosed, between the two copses, as you go up to the Capitoline Hill, a place of asylum for fugitives. Hither fled for refuge all the ragtag and bobtail from the neighboring peoples, some free, some slaves, and all of them wanting nothing but a fresh start. The mob was the first real addition to the city's strength, the first step to her future greatness. Having now adequate numbers, Romulus proceeded to temper strength with policy and turned his attention to social organization. He created 100 senators, fixing that number either because it was enough for his purpose, or because there were no more than 100 who were in the position to be made fathers, as they were called, or heads of clans. The title of fathers, patres, undoubtedly was derived from their rank, and their descendants were called patricians. Rome was now strong enough to challenge any of her neighbors, but great enough she was, her greatness seemed likely to last only for a single generation. There were not enough women, and that, added to the fact that there was no intermarriage with neighboring communities, ruled out any hope of maintaining a level of population. Romulus, accordingly, on the advice of his senators, sent representatives to the various peoples across his borders to negotiate alliances and the right of intermarriage for the newly established state. The envoys were instructed to point out that cities, like everything else, have to begin small, in course of time, helped by their own worth and the favor of heaven. Some at least grow rich and famous, and of these Rome would assuredly be one. Gods had blessed her birth, and the valor of her people would not fail in the days to come. The Romans were men, as they were. Why, then, be reluctant to intermarry with them? Romulus's overtures were nowhere favorably received. It was clear that everyone despised the new community, and at the same time feared both for themselves and for posterity the growth of this new power in their midst. More often than not, his envoys were dismissed with the question of whether Rome had thrown open her doors to female as well as to male runaways and vagabonds, as that would evidently be the most suitable way for Romans to get wives. The young Romans naturally resented this jibe, and the clash seemed inevitable. Romulus, seeing it must come, set the scene for it with elaborate care. Deliberately hiding his resentment, he prepared to celebrate the Consualia, a solemn festival in honor of Neptune, patron of the horse, and sent notice of his intention all over the neighboring countryside. The better to advertise it, his people lavished upon their preparations for the spectacle all the resources, such as they were in those days, at their command. On the appointed day, crowds flocked to Rome, partly, no doubt, out of sheer curiosity to see the new town. The majority were from the neighboring settlements of Canina, Crustumium, and Atemni, but all the Sabines were there too, and their wives and children. Many houses offered hospitable entertainment to the visitors. They were invited to inspect the fortifications, layout, and numerous buildings of the town, and expressed their surprise at the rapidity of its growth. Then the great moment came. The show began, and nobody had eyes or thoughts for anything else. This was the Romans' opportunity. At a given signal, all the able-bodied men burst through the crowd and seized the young women. Most of the girls were the prize of whoever got hold of them first, but a few conspicuously handsome ones had been previously marked down for leading senators, and these were brought to their houses by special gangs. There was one woman of much greater beauty than the rest, and the story goes that she was seized by a party of men belonging to the household of someone called Thalassius, and in reply to the many questions about whose house they were taking her to, they, to prevent anyone else laying hands upon her, kept shouting, "Thalassius, Thalassius." This was the origin of the use of the word at weddings. By this act of violence, the fun of the festival broke up in panic. The girls' unfortunate parents made good their escape, but without bitter comments on the treachery of their host and heartfelt prayers to the gods, to whose festival they had come in all good faith in the solemnity of the occasion, only to be grossly deceived. The young women were no less indignant, and as full of foreboding for the future. Romulus, however, assured them. Going from one to the other, he declared that their own parents were really to blame, in that they had been too proud to allow intermarriage with their neighbors. Nevertheless, they need not fear. As married women, they would share all the fortunes of Rome, all the privileges of the community, and they would be bound to their husbands by the dearest bond of all, their children. He urged them to forget their wrath, and give their hearts to those whom chance had given their bodies. Often, he said, a sense of injury yields in the end to affection, and their husbands would treat them all the more kindly in that they would try, each one of them, not only to fulfill their own part of the bargain, but also to make up to their wives for the homes and parents they had lost. The men, too, played their part. They spoke honeyed words and vowed that it was passionate love which had prompted their offense. No plea can better touch a woman's heart. The women, in course of time, lost their resentment, but no sooner had they learned to accept their lot and their parents began to stir up trouble in earnest. To excite sympathy, they went about dressed in mourning and pouring out their grief in tears and lamentations. Not content with confining these demonstrations within the walls of their own towns, they marched in mass to the house of Titus Tatius, the Sabine king, the greatest name in that part of the country. Official embassies, too, from various settlements, waited upon him. It seemed to the people of Caenina, Crustumium, and Antemnae, who had been involved in that trouble, that Tatius and the Sabines were unduly dilatory. So the three communities resolved to take action on their own. Of the three, however, Crustumium and Antemnae proved too slow to satisfy the impatient wrath of their partner, with the result that the men of Caenina invaded Roman territory without any support. Scattered groups of them were doing what damage they could when Romulus, at the head of his troops, appeared upon the scene. A few blows were enough, and defeat soon taught them that angry men must also be strong, if they would achieve their purpose. The Romans pursued the routed enemy. Romulus himself cut down their prince and stripped him of his arms. Then their leader, dead, took the town at the first assault. The victorious army returned, and Romulus proceeded to dispose of the spoils. Magnificent in action, he was no less eager for popular recognition and applause. He took the armor, which he had stripped from the body of the enemy commander, fixed it on a frame made for the purpose, and carried it in his own hands up to the Capitol, where, by an oak, which the shepherds regarded as a sacred tree, he laid it down as an offering to Jupiter. At the same time he determined on the site of a plot of ground to be consecrated to the god, and uttered this prayer: Jupiter, Feratrius, such was the new title he bestowed, to you I bring these spoils of victory, a king's armor, taken by a king, and within the bounds already clear to my mind's eye, I dedicate to you a holy precinct, where in days to come, following my example, other men shall lay the spoils of honor, stripped from the bodies of commanders or kings killed by their own hands. Such was the origin of the first temple consecrated in Rome. The gods ordained that Romulus, when he declared that others should bring their spoils thither, should not speak in vain. It was their pleasure, too, that the glory of that offering should not be cheapened by too frequent occurrence. The distinction of winning the spoils of honor
has been rare indeed. In the countless battles of succeeding years, it has been won on 2 occasions only. These proceedings on the capital had temporarily drawn the Romans from their farms, and a force from Antemnae took the opportunity of making a raid. Once again Roman troops pounced. The scattered troops of raiders were taken by surprise. A single charge sufficed to put them to flight. Their town was taken, and Romulus had a double victory to his credit. His wife, Hersilia, had long been pestered by the young woman who had been carried off at the festival, so she took this opportunity, when he was congratulating himself on his success, to ask him to pardon the girl's parents and allow them to come and live in Rome. It would, she urged, form a strong and valuable bond of union. The request was readily granted. Romulus's next move was against the men of Crustumnium, who were on the march against him, but the defeat of their neighbors had already undermined their confidence, and they were even more easily broken up. Settlers were sent out both to Antemnae and Crustumnium, the fertility of the soil in the latter attracting the greater number of volunteers. On the other hand, a number of people, chiefly parents or relatives of the captured women, moved from Castumium to Rome. The last to attack Rome were Sabines, and the ensuing struggle was far more serious than the previous ones. The enemy gave no notice of their intentions, and acted upon no hasty impulse of revenge or cupidity. Their plans were carefully laid, and backed by treachery. Spurius Tarpeius, the commander of the Roman citadel, had a daughter, a young girl who, when he had gone outside the walls to fetch water for sacrifice, was bribed by Tatius, the king of the Sabines, to admit a party of his soldiers into the fortress. Once inside, the men crushed her to death under their shields to make it look as if they had taken the place by storm, or it may be to show by harsh example that there must be no trusting a traitor. There is only a story that this girl had demanded as the price of her services what they had on their shield arms. Now the Sabines, in those days, used to wear on their left arms heavy gold bracelets and fine jeweled rings, so they kept their bargain, paying, however, not as the girl hoped, with golden bracelets, but with their shields. Some say that after bargaining for what they had on their left arms, she did actually demand their shields, and being proved a traitor, was killed, as it were, by the very coin that paid her. The Sabines were now in possession of the citadel. Next day the Roman troops occupied all the ground between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, and there waited till they could tolerate the situation no longer. Fiercely determined to recover the citadel, they pressed forward to the attack. This was the signal for the enemy to move down to meet them. The first blows were struck by the rival champions, Metius Curtius the Sabine, and Hostius Hostilius of Rome. The Romans were in the worst position, but they were kept going for a time by the great gallantry of Hostius. When he fell, their resistance at once collapsed, and they retreated in disorder to the Palatine Old Gate. Romulus himself was swept along by the fugitive rabble, but as he rode, he waved his sword above his head and shouted, "Hear me, O Jupiter! At the bidding of your eagles, I laid the foundations of Rome here on the Palatine. Our fortress is in Sabine hands, basely betrayed. Thence are the coming sword in hand across the valley against us. Father of the gods and men, suffer them not to set foot on the spot where now we stand. Banish fear from Roman hearts, and stop their shameful retreat. I vow a temple here to you, O Jupiter, stayer of flight, that men may remember hereafter that Rome in her trouble was saved by your help." It was almost as if he felt that his prayer was granted. A moment later, "Turn on them, Romans," he cried, "and fight once more. Jupiter himself commands it. The Romans obeyed what they believed to be the voice from heaven. They rallied, and Romulus thrust his way forward to the van. Metius Curtius had led the Sabine advance down the slope from the citadel. He had driven the Roman troops back in disorder over the ground today occupied by the Forum, and nearly reached the gate of the Palatine. "Comrades," he cried, "we have beaten our treacherous host, our feeble foes. They now know that catching girls is a different matter from fighting against men." The boast had hardly left his lips when Romulus, with a handful of his best and most courageous troops, was on him. The fact that Metius was mounted proved a disadvantage to him. He turned and galloped off, the Romans in pursuit, and the bold stroke on the part of their leader inspired the Roman troops elsewhere on the field to make a fresh effort and to rout their opponents. The yells of the pursuers so scared Metius's horse that he took the bit between his teeth and plunged with his rider into the swamps. The Sabines were aghast. The imminent threat to their champion for the moment diverted them from the work in hand, and they tried to help him by shouting advance and signaling, until at last, by a supreme effort, he struggled out to safety. The battle was then renewed in the valley between the two hills, and this time the Romans had the best of it. This was the moment when the Sabine women, the original cause of the quarrel, played their decisive part. The dreadful situation in which they found themselves banished their natural timidity and gave them courage to intervene. With loosened hair and rent garments, they braved the flying spears and thrust their way in a body between the embattled armies. They parted the angry combatants. They besought their fathers on the one side, their husbands on the other, to spare themselves the curse of shedding kindred blood. "We are mothers now," they cried. "Our children are your sons, your grandsons. Do not put on them the stain of parricide. If our marriage, if the relationship between you is hateful to you, turn your anger against us. We are the cause of strife. On our account, our husbands and fathers lie wounded or dead, and we would rather die ourselves than live on either widowed or orphaned." The effect of the appeal was immediate and profound. Silence fell, and not a man moved. A moment later, the rival captains stepped forward to conclude a peace. Indeed, they went further. The two states were united under a single government with Rome as the seat of power. Thus the population of Rome was doubled, and the Romans, as a gesture to the Sabines, called themselves Quirites, after the Sabine town of Curis. In memory of the battle, the stretch of shallow water where Curtius and his horse first struggled from the deep swamps into safety was named Curtius's Lake. This happy and unlooked for end to a bitter war strengthened the bond between the Sabine women and their parents and husbands. Romulus, moreover, marked his own special awareness of this deepened feeling by giving the women's names to the 30 wards into which he had divided the population. No doubt there were more than 30 of the women, but it was not known on what principle they were selected to give their names, whether it was by lot or age, or their own or their husband's rank. At the same time, 3 centuries of knights were created. The Ramnenses, named after Romulus, and Titienses, after Tatius, and the Luceres, the origin of whose name is uncertain. As a result of these measures, the joint rule of the 2 kings was brought into harmony. Some years later, the kinsmen of Tatius offered violence to some Laurentian envoys. The Laurentian people claimed redress under what passed in those days for international law, and Tatius allowed the ties of blood to influence his decision. The result of this was that he drew their revenge upon himself. He was murdered in a riot at Lavinium, whither he had gone to celebrate the annual sacrifice. Romulus is said to have felt less distress at his death than was strictly proper. Possibly the joint reign was not, in fact, entirely harmonious. Possibly he felt that Tatius deserved what he got. But whatever the reason, he refused to go to war and to wipe out the double stain of Tatius's murder, and the insult to the envoys renewed the pact between Rome and Lavinium. Thus there was peace with Lavinium, as welcome as it was unexpected. All the same, Rome was at once involved in hostilities with an enemy almost at the city gates. This time it was the men of Fidenae, who, in alarm at the rapid growth of a rival on their very doorstep, decided to take the offensive and to nip its power in the bud. They dispatched a force to devastate the country between the two towns. Then, turning left, the other way was barred by the river, carried on their work against the farms. The men working on the farms fled in sudden alarm and confusion to the protection of the town, and the arrival of this mob brought the first news of the raid. Romulus acted promptly. With the enemy so close, delay was dangerous. He marched out at the head of his troops and took up a position about a mile from Fidenae, where he left a small holding force. Of his main body, he ordered a part to lie in ambush, where dense overgrowth afforded cover, while with the rest, the greater number, and all his mounted troops, he challenged the enemy with a feint attack, riding with his cavalry right up to the gates of Fidenae. The ruse succeeded. The enemy were drawn, and the cavalry skirmish lent an air of genuineness to the subsequent Roman withdrawal of their mounted troops, which deliberately broke discipline as if undecided whether to fight or run. Then, when the Roman foot also began to give way, the deluded enemy came pouring en masse from behind their defenses, flung themselves with blind fury upon their retreating enemy, and were led straight into the ambush. Their flanks were promptly attacked by the Roman troops, there concealed. At the same moment, the standards of the holding force, left behind by Romulus, were seen to be advancing, and these combined threats proved too much for the Fidenaeans, who began a hurried retreat before Romulus and his mounted men even had time to wheel to the attack. A moment before, the Fidenaeans had been followed up a feigned withdrawal. Now, in good earnest and far greater disorder, they were themselves on the run for the protection of their own walls.
But they were not destined to escape. The Romans, in hot pursuit, burst into the town, close on their heels, before the gates could be shut against them. The war fever soon spread to Veii, which, like Fidenae, was an Etruscan town. It was also a close neighbor of Rome, and the danger of such propinquity, in the event of Rome proving hostile to all her neighboring communities, was a further exasperation. Accordingly, she sent a raiding force into Roman territory. It was not an organized movement. The raiders took up no regular position, but simply picked up what they could from the countryside and returned without waiting for countermeasures from Rome. The Romans, however, not finding them still in their territory, crossed the Tiber fully prepared for a decisive struggle, and assumed a position with a view to an assault upon the town. At the news of their approach, the Veientes took the field to fight it out in the open rather than be shut up within their walls and forced to stand a siege. In the fight which ensued, Romulus used no strategy. The sheer power of his veteran troops sufficed for victory, and he pursued the retreating enemy to the walls of Veii. The town itself was strongly fortified and well sited for defense. Romulus, accordingly, made no attempt to take it,
but contented himself on the return march with wasting the cultivated land, more by way of revenge than for what he could take from it. The loss of the Veientes suffered from the devastation did as much as their defeat in the field to secure their submission, and they sent envoys to Rome to treat for peace. They were mulcted of a part of their territory and granted a truce for 100 years. Such is the story of Rome's military and political achievements during the reign of Romulus. All of them chime well enough with the beliefs in his divine birth and the divinity ascribed to him after his death. One need but recall the vigor he displayed in recovering his ancestral throne, his wisdom in founding Rome, and bringing her to strength by the arts of both war and peace. It was to him, that no one else, that she owed the power which enabled her to enjoy untroubled tranquillity for the next 40 years. Great though Romulus was, he was better loved by the commons than by the Senate, and best of all by the army. He maintained, in peace as well as in war, a personal armed guard of 300 men, whom he called Celeres, the Swift. Such then were the deeds of Romulus, and they will never grow old. One day, while he was reviewing his troops on the Campus Martius near the marsh of Capra, a storm burst with violent thunder. A cloud enveloped him, so thick that it hid him from the eyes of everyone present, and from that moment he was never seen again upon earth. The troops, who had been alarmed by the sudden storm, soon recovered when it passed over, and the sun came out again. Then they saw that the throne was empty, and ready though they were to believe the senators, who had been standing at the king's side and now declared that he had been carried up on high by a whirlwind, they none the less felt like children bereft of a father, and for a long time stood in sorrowful silence. Then a few voices began to proclaim Romulus's divinity. The cry was taken up, and at last every man present hailed him as a god and son of a god, and prayed to him to be forever gracious and to protect his children. However, even on this great occasion, there were, I believe, a few dissentients, who secretly maintained that the king had been torn to pieces by the senators. At all events, the story got about, though in veiled terms, but it was not important, as awe and admiration for Romulus's greatness set the seal upon the other version of his end, which was, moreover, given further credit by the timely action of a certain Julius Proculus, a man, we are told, honored for his wise counsel on weighty matters. The loss of the king had left the people in an uneasy mood, and suspicious of the senators, and Proculus, aware of the prevalent temper, conceived the shrewd idea of addressing the assembly. Romulus, he declared, the father of our city, descended from heaven at dawn this morning and appeared to me. In awe and reverence I stood before him, praying for permission to look upon his face without sin. Go, he said, and tell the Romans that by heaven's will my Rome shall be the capital of the world. Let them learn to be soldiers. Let them know and teach their children that no power on earth can stand against Roman arms. Having spoken these words, he was taken up again into the sky. Proculus's story had a most remarkable effect. The army and commons, cruelly distressed at the loss of their king, were much comforted once they were assured of his immortality. The senators were soon quarreling over the succession to the throne. It was a rivalry of factions, not of individuals, for Rome was still too young to have produced any men of outstanding eminence. The Sabine element wanted a king of Sabine blood, for there had not been one since the death of Tatius, and they were afraid that in consequence, and in spite of their equal political rights, they might lose their title to the sovereignty. The Roman element regarded the prospect of a foreigner on the throne with abhorrence.
Despite their differences, however, both parties were united in their desire for a king, neither having yet tasted the sweets of liberty. It was obvious, meanwhile, that many of the neighboring communities were far from friendly. Rome was without a ruler, and her army without a commander, and the senators could not but see in this combination of circumstances a danger of attack. Some form of government there must be. This much was agreed, and as neither party would yield, the 100 senators determined to exercise a joint control. They divided their numbers into 10 decuries, and 1 man from each as president. These 10 performed the functions of government, though only one carried its insignia, and was attended by lictors. His period of power was limited to 5 days, and it passed to each senator in rotation. The monarchy was in abeyance for a year, and the period of its abeyance was known as the interregnum, a term still in use. The populace disliked this turn of events, and complained that it brought them 100 masters instead of 1, and even worse slavery than before. The senators, seeing that the commons were unlikely to continue to submit to any authority other than that of a king, elected moreover by themselves, decided to take the initiative by offering what in any case they were sure to lose. Accordingly, they recovered the favor of the populace by granting them supreme power, but on condition that their election of a king should be valid only if it were ratified by themselves, thus keeping, in effect, as much power as they gave. The same right is exercised in political affairs today, though it has now become a mere empty form. Before the Commons vote, the Senate ratifies the result, whatever it may be. The interrex, on the occasion of which I am speaking, called an assembly of the people, men of Rome, he said, may luck and ever-blessing attend us. Choose your king, for such is the senators' decision. If a man you choose is worthy successor to Romulus, the senators will ratify your choice. The commons were delighted, determined to show no less generosity than their masters. They passed a resolution that the election should be decided by a decree of the Senate. Numa Pompilius had a great reputation at this time for justice and piety. He lived in the Sabine town of Cures, and was, by the standards of antiquity, deeply learned in all the laws of God and man. It has been said that he owed his learning to Pythagoras of Samos, but this is a mere shot in the dark, and is obviously untrue, as it was not till 100 years later, in the reign of Servius Tullius, that Pythagoras is known to have settled in southern Italy, in the neighborhood of Metapontum, Heraclea, and Croton, where he formed groups of young men eager to study his philosophy. But even if the dates fitted, how could Pythagoras' fame have reached the Sabines all the way from the south? What mutually intelligible language could he have used to awaken amongst them the desire for learning? Under whose protection could a man have traveled along through so many peoples, all differing in language and manner of life? No, my own belief is on the contrary, that Numa's noble qualities were all his own. It was not foreign learning that made him what he was, but the harsh, austere discipline of the ancient Sabines, most incorruptible of men. Numa's name was put forward as successor to the throne, and the Senate naturally felt that a Sabine king would unduly increase the influence of the Sabine element in the community. Nevertheless, nobody ventured to put forward as a rival candidate either himself or another of his faction, or indeed any man at all, either senator or citizen, with the result that there was a unanimous decision to offer Numa the crown. He was therefore summoned to the city, and there expressed the wish that the gods should be consulted on his behalf, as in the case of Romulus, who at the founding of Rome had assumed power only after the omens had been duly observed. An augur, whose service on the occasion was afterwards recognized by the grant of a permanent state priesthood, escorted Numa to the citadel, where he took his seat on a stone with his face to the south. The augur, with veiled head, sat on his left, holding in his right hand the smooth, crook-handled staff called the litus. Gazing out over the city and the country beyond, he uttered a prayer, and marking with a glance the space of sky from east to west, and declaring the southward section to be right, and the northward section left, he took an imaginary point full front of him, and as far away as eyes could reach, transferred the staffs to his left hand, placed his right upon Numa's head, and spoke these solemn words: Father Jupiter, if it is heaven's will that this man Numa Pompilius, whose head I touch, should reign in the city of Rome, make clear to us sure signs within those limits I have determined. Then he named precisely the nature of the signs he hoped would be sent. Sent they were, and Numa, duly proclaimed king, went down from the hill where the auspices were taken. Rome had originally been founded by force of arms. The new king now prepared to give the community a second beginning, this time on the solid basis of law and religious observance. These lessons, however, could never be learned while his people were constantly fighting. War, he well knew, was no civilizing influence, and the proud spirit of his people could be tamed only if they learned to lay aside their swords. Accordingly, at the foot of the Argoletum, he built the temple of Janus, to serve as a visible sign of the alterations of peace and war. Upon it was to signify that the city was in arms, closed that war against all neighboring peoples had been brought to a successful conclusion. Since Numa's reign, the temple has twice been closed, once in the consulship of Manlius, at the end of the first war with Carthage, and again on the occasion which we ourselves were allowed by heaven to witness, when after the battle of Actium, Augustus Caesar brought peace to the world by land and sea. Numa himself closed it after first securing the goodwill of all the neighboring communities by treaties of alliance. Rome was now at peace. There was no immediate prospect of attack from outside, and the tight rein of constant military discipline was relaxed. In these novel circumstances, there was an obvious danger of a general relaxation of a nation's moral fibre. So, to prevent its occurrence, Numa decided upon a step which he felt would prove more effective than anything else with a mob as rough and ignorant as the Romans were in those days. This was to inspire them with the fear of the gods. Such a sentiment was unlikely to touch them unless he first prepared them by inventing some sort of marvelous tale. He pretended, therefore, that he was in the habit of meeting the goddess Egeria by night, and that it was her authority which guided him in the establishment of such rites as were most acceptable to the gods in the appointment of priests to serve each particular duty. His first act was to divide the year into 12 lunar months, and because 12 lunar months come a few days short of a full solar year, he inserted intercalary months so that every 20 years the cycle should be completed, the days coming round again to correspond with the position of the sun from which they had started. Secondly, he fixed what came to be known as lawful and unlawful days. Days, that is, when public business might or might not be transacted, as he foresaw that it would be convenient to have certain specific times when no measures should be brought before the people. Next, he turned his attention to the appointment of priests. Most of the religious ceremonies, especially those which are now in the hands of the Flamen Dialis, or priest of Jupiter. He was in the habit of presiding over himself, but he foresaw that in a martial community like Rome, future kings were likely to resemble Romulus rather than himself, and to be often, in consequence, away from home on active service, and for that reason appointed a priest of Jupiter on a permanent basis, marking the importance of the office by the grant of special robes and the use of royal curule chair. This step ensured that the religious duties attached to the royal office should never be allowed to lapse. At the same time, two other priesthoods, Tamars and Quirinus, were created. He further appointed virgin priestesses for the service of Vesta, a cult which originated in Alba, and was therefore not foreign to Numa, who brought it to Rome. The priestesses were paid out of public funds to enable them to devote their whole time to the temple service, and were invested with special sanctity by the imposition of various observances, of which the chief was virginity. The 12 Salii, or leaping priests, in the service of Mars Gradivus, were also introduced by Numa. They were given the uniform of an embroidered tunic and bronze breastplate, and their special duty was to carry the ancilia, or sacred shields, one of which was fabled to have fallen from heaven, as they moved through the city, chanting their hymns to the triple beat of their ritual dance. Numa's next act was to appoint as pontifex the senator Numa Marcius, son of Marcus. He gave him full written instructions for all religious observances, specifying for the various sacrifices the place, the time, and the nature of the victim, and how many was to be raised to meet the cost. He also gave the pontifex the right of decision in all other matters connected with both public and private observances, so the ordinary people might have someone to consult if they needed advice to prevent the confusion which might result from neglect of national religious rites or the adoption of foreign ones. It was the further duty of the pontifex to teach the proper forms for the burial of the dead and the propitiation of the spirits of the departed, and to establish what portents manifested by lightning or other visible signs were to be recognized and acted upon, to elicit information on this subject from a divine source. Numa consecrated on the Aventine an altar to Jupiter Eleusis, whom he consulted by augury as to what signs from heaven it should be proper to regard. By these means, the whole population of Rome was given a great many new things to think about and attend to, with the result that everybody was diverted from military preoccupations. They now had serious matters to consider, and believing, as they now did, that the heavenly powers took part in human affairs, they became so much absorbed in the cultivation of religion and so deeply imbued with the sense of their religious duties that the sanctity of an oath had more power to control their lives than the fear of punishment for law-breaking. Men of all classes took Numa as their unique example, and modeled themselves upon him, until the effect of this change of heart was felt, even beyond the borders of Roman territory. Once Rome's neighbors had considered her not so much as a city as an armed camp in their midst, threatening the general peace. Now they came to revere her so profoundly as a community dedicated wholly to worship, that the mere thought of offering her violence seemed to them like sacrilege. There was a certain little copse, watered summer and winter by the stream, of which the spring was in a dark grotto. Numa often visited the copse alone to meet, as he put it, the goddess Egeria. He accordingly declared it sacred to the Muses as the spot where they met to converse with his wife. He instituted an annual ceremony dedicated to troth-keeping, with priests whose duty was to drive in a covered wagon, drawn by a pair of horses, to the place of celebration, and there perform their rites with hands swathed to the fingers, signifying that troth must be religiously preserved, and that she dwelt inviolable in a man's right hand. Many other rites owe their inception to Numa, together with various places, known by the priests as argi, dedicated to their performance.
But the grandest achievement of his reign was that throughout its course he remained the jealous guardian of peace even more than power. Thus, two successive kings, each, though in opposite ways, added strength to the growing city. Romulus by war, Numa by peace. Romulus reigned 37 years, Numa 43. When Numa died, Rome, by the twin disciplines of peace and war, was as eminent for self-mastery as for military power. A second interregnum followed Numa's death. Then, by the vote of the people, ratified by the Senate, Tullus Hostilius, grandson of Hostilius, who fought the fine action on the lower slopes of the Palatine against the Sabines, was elected to succeed him. He proved a very different man from his predecessor, indeed. In his lust for action he surpassed Romulus himself, driven, as he was, along the path of adventure by his grandfather's name and the strength of his own young manhood. In his view, Rome had been allowed to lapse into senility, and his one object was to find cause for renewed military adventure. It so happened that a series of reciprocal cattle raids was going on across the borders of Roman and Alban territory, ruled at that time by Gaius Cluilius. From both states, envoys were sent almost simultaneously to negotiate the recovery of the stolen property. The Roman party had orders to carry out their instructions immediately they arrived. Their demand would certainly be refused, and the refusal would allow Tullus to declare war with a good conscience. The envoys from Alba were less prompt in coming to business. Welcomed by Tullus, with every mark of gracious hospitality, they attended the state banquet, as if nothing were amiss, while the Roman envoys had already made their demand for restitution and replied to Cluilius's refusal by a declaration of war to take effect in 30 days. They then returned to Rome and made their report, whereupon Tullus asked the envoys from Alba to state the object of their mission. Not knowing what had happened, they replied, not without embarrassment, that the last thing they wanted was to say anything disagreeable to their host. But orders were orders, and it was their duty to declare that they had come to demand restitution of stolen property, and to declare war in the event of a refusal. "Tell your king," Tullus answered, "that the king of Rome calls the gods to witness which of our two peoples was the first to refuse the demand for redress. Our prayer is that the guilty nation may suffer all the misery of the coming war." Tullus's words were duly reported in Alba, and preparations on a grand scale were put in hand by both peoples for a struggle which was to all intents and purposes a civil war. Romans and Albans were both of Trojan stock. Lavinium had been settled by men from Troy, Alba by men from Lavinium, and the Romans sprang from the line of the Alban kings. War between them would be like father against son. Luckily, however, what actually happened made the struggle less grievous than it might have been. No full-scale battle was fought. One only of the two cities was demolished, and the two peoples ended by amalgamating. The Albans were first in the field, and with a large force took up an entrenched position within Roman territory, and not more than 5 miles from the town. The name, Cluilius's Trench, stuck to the spot for some centuries afterwards, until the actual digging disappeared, and the name fell into abeyance. It so happened that Cluilius died while his men were holding this position, and the supreme command was given by the Albans to Metius Fufetius. Cluilius's death acted like a tonic upon Tullus. The powers of heaven, he declared, had begun their vengeance on the wicked war-makers. Their king had been the first to suffer,
Soon the wrath of God would be felt by every man and woman in Alba. With the boost still on his lips, he advanced under cover of darkness, past the enemy's position into Alban territory. The move roused Metius to action. Leaving his entrenchments, he made straight for the Roman army, sending in advance a spokesman with orders to propose to Tullus that a conference should be held before engaging. For he was confident, should Tullus agree to meet him, that he could make a suggestion which would prove of equal value to both parties. Tullus did not reject the proposal. Nevertheless, in case the conference should prove abortive, he took the precaution of setting his troops in order of battle. The Albans followed suit, and Tullus and Metius, attended by a few high officers, stepped forward to meet each other between the marshaled armies. Metius was the first to speak. "Our king, Cluilius," he said, "told me, if I remember, that we were about to fight over a matter of brigandage and the refusal to restore stolen property in accordance with our treaty, and I have no doubt that you, Tullus, are prepared to retort in similar terms. So be it. If, however, we let specious arguments go and tell each other the truth, we should admit that our two nations, close neighbors and blood relations as we are, have a deeper reason for going to war. I mean ambition and the love of power. Whether rightly or wrongly, I will not venture to say, for that is a question decided, no doubt, by him who undertook to wage this war. As for me, I am only the man the Albans chose to conduct it. But what I would suggest to you, Tullus, is this. You know the strength of the Etruscans who threaten to encircle us, and you know it even better than we, as you are closer to them. They are strong on land, and at sea very strong indeed. Do not forget, when you give the signal for battle, that they will be watching us, ready when we have worn out each other, to attack us both, victor and vanquished alike. Surely, therefore, unless both our countries are condemned to perdition, we should be able to find a better solution. The assurance of liberty is not, it seems, enough for us, and we are about to gamble for empire or slavery. Nevertheless, can we not find some means of deciding the issue between us, which, however the fight may go, will at least avoid crippling losses either to you or to ourselves?" Tullus was not displeased by the proposal, though he was confident of victory, and enjoyed a fight as much as any man. Ways and means were therefore considered. A plan was adopted, and a fortunate circumstance provided the means of carrying it out. In each army there were 3 brothers, triplets, all equally young and active, belonging to the families of the Horatii and Curiatii. That these were the names has never been in doubt, and the story is one of the great stories of ancient times, yet in spite of its celebrity historians have disagreed about which name belonged to which set of brothers. The majority, I find, say that the Horatii were Roman, and I am willing to follow their lead. To these young men, the 2 rival commanders made their proposal that they should fight, 3 against 3, as the champions of their countries, the victorious to have dominion over the vanquished. The proposal was accepted. The time and place for the contest were arranged, and a solemn agreement entered into by the Romans and Albans to the effect that whichever of the 2 peoples should prove victorious, through the prowess of its champions, should be undisputed master of the other. The terms of treaties, of course, vary according to circumstance, but the form remains constant. On the present occasion, that of the oldest treaty on record, the procedure we read was as follows. The Fetial priest approached Tullus, the king. "My lord," he said. He asked, "Do you bid me make this compact with the representative of the Alban people? I do. Then I demand of you, my lord, the holy herb. Go and pluck it, untainted. The priest brought from the sacred enclosure a fresh green plant and said, My lord, do you grant me, with my emblems and companions, the king's sanction to speak for the people of Rome? I grant it, the king replied, without prejudice to myself and the people of Rome. The priest was Marcus Valerius, and he appointed Spurius Faucius, touching his head and hair with the ceremonial leaves, as pater patratus, or spokesman, whose duty is to pronounce the oath and thus to solemnize the compact. This he does in a long metrical formula, which is not worth the trouble of quoting here. Finally, the terms of the treaty have been read out. Hear me, Jupiter, Fusius cried. Hear me, Alba, and you who speak on her behalf. From the terms of this compact, as they have been publicly and openly read from these tablets today and clearly understood by us assembled here, the Roman people will never be the first to depart. Should they do so treacherously and by public consent, then, great Jove, I pray that thou mayest strike them even as I strike this pig, and the more fiercely in thy power and might are greater than mine. He then dispatched the pig with a flint knife. The Albans, on the other side, took a similar oath, according to their own formula, and the treaty was made. The 6 companions now made ready for battle. As they stepped forward into the list between the 2 armies, their hearts were high, and ringing in their ears were the voices of friends, bidding them remember that their parents, their country, and their country's gods, their fellow soldiers, and all they loved at home would be watching their prowess, and that all eyes were on their swords. The rival armies were still in position. Danger there was none, but every man present was tense with anxiety. The stakes were high. Upon the luck or valor of 3 men hung empire or slavery. In an agony of suspense, the onlookers prepared for the spectacle. The trumpet blared. The brothers drew their swords, and with all the pride of embattled armies advanced to the combat. Careless of death and danger, each thought only of his country's fate, of the grim choice between lordship and ignominy, which they, themselves, and they only, were about to decide. They met. At the flash of steel and the clang of shields on shield, a thrill ran through the massed spectators, breathless and speechless, while as yet neither side had the advantage. Soon the combatants were locked in a deadly grapple. Bodies writhed and twisted. The leaping blades parried and thrust. The blood began to flow. Alba's 3 companions were wounded. A Roman fell. Then another stretched across his body, and both at the point of death. A cheer burst out from the Alban army as the 2 Romans went down, while from their adversaries all hope was gone. Life seemed to drain from them as they contemplated the dreadful predicament of their one survivor, surrounded by the 3 Cariati. The young man, though alone, was unhurt. No match for his 3 opponents together. He was yet confident of his ability to face them singly, and with this purpose in mind, he took to his heels, sure that they would be after him with such speed as their wounds followed. Not far from the scene of the first fight, he looked back. His 3 enemies were coming, strung out one behind the other, the foremost almost upon him. He turned and attacked him furiously. A cry rose from the Alban army, "Your brother! Save him!" But it was too late. Horatius had already killed his man, and, flushed with triumph, was looking for his next victim. The Romans' cheer for their young soldier was like the roar of the crowd, at the race when luck turns defeat into victory. Horatius pressed on to make an end. He killed his second man before the last, near though he was, could come to his aid. Now it was 1 against 1, but the two antagonists were far from equally matched in all else that makes for victory. Horatius was unhurt, and elated by his double success. His opponent, exhausted by running and loss of blood, could hardly drag himself along. His brothers had been killed before his eyes. He was a beaten man facing a victorious enemy. What followed cannot be called a fight. "I have killed 2 already," the Roman cried. "To avenge my brother's ghost, I offer the last to settle our quarrel, that Rome may be mistress of Alba." With these proud words, he plunged his sword with a downward stroke into the throat of his enemy, now too weak to sustain his shield, and then stripped him where he lay. The cheering ranks of the Roman army, whose joy was the keener by the narrow escape from disaster, welcomed back their champion. The two sides then buried their dead, a common task, but performed with very different feelings by victors and vanquished. Alba was subject now to her Roman mistress. The graves are still to be seen at the place where each man fell, those of the 2 Romans together in the direction of Alba, those of the 3 Albans nearer Rome and at some distance from each other. Before the troops left their stations, Metius asked Tullus what by the terms of the agreement he now required him to do, and Tullus instructed him to keep his men under arms, as they would be a useful reinforcement if Rome should find herself at war with Veii. At the head of the Roman army, on its return to the city, marched Horatius, carrying his triple spoils, and it so happened that outside the Campina gate he met his sister, a young girl who had been betrothed to one of the Curiatae. Slung across her brother's shoulders was a cloak, and she recognized it as the cloak she had made with her own hands for her lover. The sight overcame her. She loosed her hair, and in a voice choked with tears, called her dead lover's name. That his sister should dare to grieve at the very moment of his own triumph, and in the midst of national rejoicing, filled Horatius with such uncontrollable rage that he drew his sword and stabbed her to the heart. "Take your girl's love," he shouted, "and give it to your lover in hell. What is Rome to such as you, or your brothers, living or dead? So perish all Roman women who mourn for an enemy." There were none who did not feel the honor of this deed. Horatius, in spite of the great service he had just rendered to his country, was arrested and brought for trial before the king. Tullus shrank from the responsibility of passing the death sentence, which must, in the circumstances, have proved unpopular. So he summoned a mass meeting and informed the populace of his intention to appoint the special officers known as the duumvirs to convict Horatius of treason according to the regular law. The wording of the law was solemn and awe-inspiring. "Let the duumvirs," it ran, "pass judgment for treason. If the prisoner should appeal, let the appeal be weighed. If the conviction is maintained, let the officer of the law veil the prisoner's head, hang him with a rope on a barren tree, and scourge his body within or without the city walls." The duumvirs were duly appointed, and, on the supposition that by the letter of the law they were bound to convict even an innocent man, one of them addressed the prisoner with the words, "Publius Horatius, I find you guilty of treason. Lictor, bind his arms." The lictor stepped forward and was about to pinion him when Tullus intervened. Tullus was anxious to temper the severity of the law and urged the prisoner to appeal. Horatius did so, and his appeal was submitted to the judgment of the people. In the course of the hearing, the decisive factor was the statement of Horatius's father, to the effect that his daughter deserved her death. Had it been otherwise, he declared, he would have exercised his right to punish his son himself. He then appealed to the people to remember the fine family of children he so recently possessed, and begged them not to leave him wholly bereft. Men of Rome, he cried, embracing his son and pointing to the spoils of war set up in the place now known as the Horatian spears, have you the heart to see this young soldier, fresh from the joy and pride of victory, bound and beaten and tortured and forced to bend his neck under the yoke? Even the men of Alba might shudder at the sight so shameful. Do your work, lictor. Bind the hands whose sword yesterday gave Rome dominion. Blindfold our liberator's eyes. Hang him on a barren tree, scourge him within the walls, yes, in sight of the spears he took from the dead hands of his enemies, or outside, if you will, amongst the tombs where those same enemies lie. For wherever you take him, the visible reminder of his noble service will surely save him from so foul a punishment. The young man's courage in the face of this peril, as of all others, no less than the father's moving appeal, had its due effect. Though he was guilty in law, popular admiration of his quality obtained his acquittal. It was felt none the less that something, at any rate, should be done to mitigate the stain of so notorious a murder. So the father was bidden to perform, at the public cost, certain ceremonies which would expiate the crime. These ceremonies, which were duly gone through, became from that day traditional in the Horatian family. After their performance, a piece of timber was slung across the roadway, and the young Horatius was made to pass beneath it with covered head, as under the yoke of submission. The timber is still to be seen, replaced from time to time at the state's expense, and is known as the Sisters' Beam. The tomb of the murdered girl was built of hewn stone and stands on the spot where she was struck down. Peace with Alba was not of long duration. Metius, a man of weak character, was unable to deal with the resentment of his people at what they felt to have been the folly of entrusting the nation's future to 3 men. The policy, in itself a good one, had failed, and in the hope of regaining his popularity, Metius now had recourse to dubious methods. In war, he had wanted peace. Now in peace, he wanted war. Accordingly, as he knew his people, despite their courage, had little military strength, he proceeded to tamper with the neighboring tribes. These he urged to declare war openly on Rome, intending that his own people, nominally Rome's allies, should in due course betray her. The people of Fadinae, a colony of Rome, were induced, in concert with Veii, to declare war by a promise that Alba would join them. Tullus, at the secession of Fadinae, sent an order to Metius to join him with his troops, and promptly took the field. Crossing the Anio, he halted at the confluence of the rivers. Somewhere between him and Fadinae, the Veientian troops had crossed the Tiber, and formed the right wing, resting on the river, while the men of Fadinae formed the left, nearer the hills. Tullus stationed his own troops so as to confront the Veientians, and sent the Alban contingent to deal with the Fadinites. Metius, however, the Alban commander, proved as much coward as traitor, not daring either to stand his ground or openly to desert. He began a cautious withdrawal to the hills. At what he thought to be a sufficient distance, he brought up his whole force and deployed it, simply as a ruse for gaining time. until events should make up his mind for him, for his intention was to join the victors. The Roman troops, who had been in touch with the Albans and now found their flank exposed, were at a loss to account for their withdrawal. Then a messenger galloped up to the king with the report that the Alban army was deserting. It was a critical situation. Tullus, having vowed to create 12 Salian priests and to dedicate shrines to Palor and Panic, ordered the messenger back into the line. He spoke at the top of his voice so that everything he said might be heard by the enemy, and added that there was no need for the alarm, as the Albans were obeying his own orders to envelop the Fidenates and attack their unprotected rear. At the same time he ordered the cavalry to raise their spears vertically to form a screen which prevented most of the Roman infantry from seeing the Albans moving off. Those who did see them were encouraged by what Tullus had said to fight with greater vigor. It was now the enemy's turn to be alarmed. Tullus's loud assertion had been audible enough, and most of the Fidenates understood Latin, as immigrants from Rome had settled amongst them in the past. They accordingly beat a retreat, to obviate the danger of being cut off from home by a sudden descent of the Albans from the hills. Tullus attacked, made short work of the Fidenates on the wing, and then turned with increased fury on the Veientians, who were already shaken by their friends' discomfiture. Their resistance broke, and they fled in disorder to the river in their rear. Checked by the river in their efforts to escape, some threw away their arms and plunged blindly into the water, while others were caught and killed on the bank before they could make up their minds whether to fight or flee. It was the bloodiest battle that Rome had yet fought. After the action, the Alban troops, who had taken no part whatever in it, marched down from the hills. Metius congratulated Tullus on his success. Tullus made a courteous reply. He expressed the hope that their luck would hold, and gave orders that the Roman and Alban troops should bivouac together for the night, as on the following day he proposed to offer a lustral sacrifice. At dawn next morning all was ready, and he issued to both armies the customary order to assemble. The Albans, who formed their outer lines of the camp, were the first to be summoned by the criers, and took their stand immediately in front of the king, the better to enjoy the novel experience of hearing him address his troops. The Romans had already received instructions to parade armed, and were drawn up around the Albans, the centurions having been cautioned to obey all orders promptly. Tullus then spoke. "My men," he said, "if ever in any war you have had cause to be thankful to God's mercy and your own valor, it was in yesterday's action. You were fighting yesterday not against your enemy only. You had a worse and more dangerous foe, the treachery of your friends. I want you to now know the truth. When the Albans withdrew to the hills, it was by no order of mine. When you heard me say that I had given that order, it was a deliberate falsehood, for I did not wish you to know of your allies' desertion, lest you should lose heart, and at the same time I was confident that fear of being surrounded would break the resistance of the enemy. Now the guilt of desertion does not rest upon the Alban troops as a whole. The men merely followed their commander, as you would have done yourselves, and I required to shift our position. No, Metius is the guilty man. Metius led the movement from the field. Metius, by his machinations, started this war. Metius is the treaty breaker. I now propose to make such an example of him that nobody will ever be likely to commit such crimes again. Armed centurions stepped forward to guard the culprit, and Tullus proceeded. My purpose, men of Alba, and I pray that it may bring happiness and prosperity to us all, is to transfer to Rome the entire population of your city. Your commons shall have Roman citizenship, your nobles the right to be elected senators. We shall be one city, one commonwealth. Long ago the Alban people split into two. Let them now be reunited. The Alban troops were unarmed and surrounded by armed men. One sentiment at least was shared by all of them when they heard these words, and that was fear. Not a man spoke. Tullus turned to Metius. Metius Fafetius, he said, were you capable of learning loyalty to abide by your word, I should have let you live. I should have taught you myself. But you are not capable. No medicine can cure your mind's disease. So be it. Your punishment may teach mankind to hold sacred the honor you have besmirched. Yesterday, you could not decide between Fidenae and Rome. Doubtless it was a painful division of mine, but today the division of your body will be more painful still. 2 chariots were brought up, each drawn by 4 horses. Metius was tied, spread-eagled, to both of them. At a touch of the whip, the 2 teams sprang forward in opposite directions, carrying with them the fragments of the mangled body, still held by the ropes. All eyes were averted from the disgusting spectacle, never in all our history repeated. That was the first and last time the fellow countrymen of ours inflicted a punishment so utterly without regard to the laws of humanity. Save for the one instance, we can fairly claim to have been content with more humane forms of punishment than any other nation. Meanwhile, mounted troops had been sent to Alba to deal with the transference of the population, and the force of infantry followed, charged with the task of pulling down the buildings of the town. There was no panic when the soldiers marched in, none of the wild confusion of the captured town when a victorious army, forcing its way through smashed gates and over the rubble of battled walls, spread with yells of triumph through every street and alley, dealing universal destruction with fire and sword. None of the horror of the citadel falling to the final assault. On the contrary, there was silence, the silence of despair, and the grief which could not speak. All hearts were numbed, all minds bewildered. Looking at their positions, the unhappy people could not decide what to take or what to leave. Again and again they asked each other's advice, now standing distraught before their doors, now wandering aimlessly through the familiar rooms, which they would never see again. Soon the Roman cavalrymen shouted their orders. It was time to leave, and the harsh command could not be disobeyed. On the outskirts of the town was heard the crash of falling masonry. In this direction and that, clouds of rising dust darkened the sky. Alba's hour had come. People hurriedly snatched up what they could of their poor possessions, and the melancholy exodus began. The houses where they had been born and reared, the gods of their hearth, all they held sacred, were left behind forever. The roads were packed with refugees in an unbroken line. Pity at the sight of others as wretched as themselves renewed their tears. Women and men, too, sobbed aloud as they passed the august temples where armed soldiers stood on guard, for it seemed they were leaving even their gods in captivity. As soon as the inhabitants of the town had left, every building, public and private, was levelled to the ground. In a single hour the work of 400 years lay in utter ruin. Only the temples, by Tullus's order, were left standing. A result of the fall of Alba was an increase in the size of Rome. The population was doubled. The Caelian hill was taken into the city boundaries, and to encourage building in that quarter, Tullus chose it as the site of a new palace, which became from that time forward his official residence. The number of families of senatorial rank was increased by the admission of some of the Alban nobility, such as the Tullii, Servilii, Quinctii, Geganii, Cariatii, and Clolii. For the order thus enlarged, Tullus built, for their solemn deliberations, the Senate House, which still, a generation ago, was known as the Curia Hostilia. Finally, 10 squadrons of Alban knights were formed, the old infantry battalions recruited from the same source, and fresh battalions enlisted. Thus, all 3 orders in the Commonwealth received an addition to their strength from the newcomers. Tullus soon felt strong enough to declare war on the Sabines, who at that period were the most populous and powerful nation in Italy, the Etruscans excepted. There were grievances on both sides, and neither had succeeded in getting redress. Tullus had lodged frequent complaints of the seizure in a crowded market, at the shrine of Feronia, of Roman citizens, who had gone to do business there. The Sabines retorted that the Romans were the first offenders in that they arrested and detained in Rome Sabine refugees who had sought sanctuary. The Sabines had not forgotten that a part of their manpower had been transferred to Rome long ago by Tatius, and they were well aware of the recent addition to Roman strength, which had followed their defeat of Alba. They began, in consequence, to look round for external aid. Across the border lay Etruria, and the nearest Etruscan town was Veii. In Veii, war had left certain smoldering resentments, always a rich soil for revolt, and a number of men volunteered to serve. A few paupers and vagabonds were also persuaded by the prospect of pay, but no regular assistance of any kind was forthcoming, and the government at Veii held firmly to the truce made long before with Romulus. On both sides, preparations for war were now in full swing, and it was becoming plain that the advantage would lie with whoever made the first move. It was Tullus who struck. He invaded Sabine territory, and a bloody battle was fought at a place called Mantrap Wood. The engagement ended in a Roman victory, due more than anything else to the strength of their recently augmented cavalry, whose rapid charge flung the Sabines into such disorder that they were unable, without severe losses, either to reorganize or to extricate themselves by a withdrawal. Just at the moment when, after the defeat of the Sabines, Tullus and Rome were more prosperous and respected than ever before, a disturbing thing happened. A shower of stones, or so it was reported to the king and senate, had fallen on the Alban Mount. A party was sent to investigate this improbable story, which turned out to be true, for before the very eyes of the investigators, stones in large numbers fell from the sky and lay on the ground like drifted hail. At the same time, a great voice seemed to issue from the grove on the top of the hill, bidding the Albans return to the religion of their fathers, which they had allowed to fall into abeyance, as if the gods of Alba had been left alone in their abandoned shrines, while the people turned faithlessly to the deities of Rome to forget religion altogether in anger at their fate. These strange events affected the Romans too. By the advice of their soothsayers, or perhaps even as a direct result of the mysterious voice from the hilltop, they decreed a 9-day public holiday for religious observance, and it was agreed that a similar festival should be held regularly in future should the phenomenon be repeated. Not long afterward, there was an outbreak of the plague. the king's heart was always set upon war, and for a time he allowed no respite from military service in spite of the obvious reluctance of his subjects in their present unhappy circumstances. Moreover, he professed to believe that men of military age would keep healthier under arms than idling at home. However, he finally fell ill himself, and protracted sickness caused him to change his mind. With the loss of his physical strength, his proud spirit was so broken that he seemed to become another man. He who had once thought preoccupation with religion utterly unworthy of a king, suddenly found himself wide open, as it were, to the influence of every sort of superstition, great or small, and doing his best to inspire his subjects with a similar sense of the presence and power of the supernatural. Everyone in Rome was soon agreed that a return to the state of things under Numa was now their only resource, and that the only way of getting rid of the plague was to pray to heaven for pardon and peace. The story goes that Tullus found in the commentaries of Numa, which he was turning over one day, a reference to Numa, certain secret rites in honor of Jupiter Ilicius. He performed these rites unknown to anybody. Apparently, however, his procedure was incorrect, for not only was he denied any divine manifestation, but cruelly punished for his error. Jupiter was angry. The palace was struck by lightning, and Tullus perished in the flames. He had won great victory as a soldier and reigned 32 years. In accordance with long-standing custom, power on the death of Tullus reverted to the Senate, which named in Interrex. At the subsequent election, the people's choice, ratified by the Senate, fell upon Ancus Marcius, the grandson on the mother's side of Numa Pompilius. Ancus was deeply conscious of his grandfather's noble record, and well aware that the splendid achievements of his predecessor, Tullus, had fallen seriously short in one respect: the neglect or misconduct of religious observances. In the belief, therefore, that nothing was more important than the restoration of the national religion in the form established by Numa, he instructed the pontifex to copy out from his commentaries the details of all the various ceremonies, and to display the document in public. To the war-weary Romans, the prospect of peace seemed assured, and both they and their neighbors began to hope that the new king was to prove a second Numa. This was the Latins' opportunity. There had been a treaty between Rome and Latium in Tullus's reign, but now the Latins felt that they might, in the changed circumstances, be a match for their old enemy. Accordingly, they raided Roman territory, and to the subsequent demand for restitution returned a haughty answer. Convinced that Ancus was no soldier and would play the king only amongst his shrines and altars, however, there was more than one side to Ancus's character. He had in him something of Numa and something of Romulus too. He well understood the value of a policy of peace when Rome was young and her people still somewhat wild, but at the same time he knew that he could not himself enjoy without injury the tranquillity which in Numa's reign had brought such benefits. Hostile peoples were already beginning to prick him to see how much he would stand, and the result was not to his credit. Times were difficult, and called for a Tullus rather than a Numa. In one respect, however, Ancus did follow Numa's lead, though with a difference. Numa had established religious observances in time of peace. Ancus provided war with an equivalent solemn ceremonial of its own. It was not enough, he thought, that wars should be fought. He believed that they should also be formally declared, and for this purpose he adopted from the ancient tribe of the Equicolae the legal formalities, now in the hands of the Fitials, by which a state demands redress for a hostile act. The procedure was as follows. When the envoy arrives at the frontier of the state from which satisfaction is sought, he covers his head with a woolen cap and says, "Hear me, Jupiter. Hear me, land of so-and-so. Hear me, O righteousness. I am the accredited spokesman of the Roman people. I come as their envoy, in the name of justice and religion, and ask credence for my words." The particular demands follow, and the envoy, calling Jupiter to witness, proceeds. If my demand for the restitution of those men, or those gods, be contrary to religion and justice, then never let me be a citizen of my country. The formula, with only minor changes, is repeated when the envoy crosses the frontier. To the first man he subsequently meets when he passes through the gate of the town, and when he enters the public square. If his demand is refused after 33 days, the statutory number, war is declared in the following form. Hear Jupiter, hear Janus, Quirinus, hear all ye gods in heaven, on earth, and under the earth. I call you to witness that the people of so-and-so are unjust and refuse reparation. But concerning these things we will consult the elders of our country, how we may obtain our due. The envoy then returns to Rome for consultation. The formula, in which the king asked the opinion of the elders, was approximately this. Of the goods or suits or causes concerning which the representative of the Roman people has made demands of the representative of the ancient Latins, and of the people of the ancient Latins, which goods or suits or causes they have failed to restore or settle or satisfy, all of them requiring restoration or settlement or satisfaction, speak. What think you? The person thus first addressed replied, I hold that those things be sought by means of just and righteous war. Thus I give my vote and my consent. The same question was put to the others in rotation, and if a majority voted in favor, war was agreed upon. The Fetial thereupon proceeded to the enemy frontier, carrying a spear with a head either of iron or hardened wood, and in the presence of not less than 3 men of military age, made the following proclamation. Whereas the peoples of the ancient Latins and the men of Priscus Latinus have committed acts and offences against the Roman people, and whereas the Roman people have commanded that there be war with the ancient Latins, and the Senate of the Roman people has ordained, consented, and voted that there be war in the ancient Latins, I therefore, and the Roman people thereby, declare and make war on the peoples of the ancient Latins, and the men of the ancient Latins. The formal declaration made, the spear was thrown across the frontier. It was in this form that redress was demanded of the Latins on the occasions of which we are speaking, and war declared. The same formal procedure was adopted by subsequent generations. Religious matters were now left by Ancus in the hands of the various orders of priests, while he himself raised fresh troops and marched to the Latin town of Politorium, which he took by assault. The inhabitants he transferred bodily to Rome. Former kings had increased the size of Rome by the absorption of conquered peoples, so the policy was not without precedent. The Palatine Hill was where the Romans first settled. On one side of it were the capital and citadel, subsequently occupied by the Sabines, and on the other lay the Caelian Hill, occupied by the Albans. The Aventine was assigned to the newcomers, and they were joined soon after others from the captured towns of Tylenai and Phacana. Politorium, denuded of its people, was later reoccupied and again attacked by Rome, this time to prevent it from becoming a regular place of refuge for their enemies. The Romans saw fit to raze it to the ground, The war dragged on, until at last all the Latin troops were forced back upon Medulla. The town was well fortified and strongly garrisoned. From a position outside the fortifications, the Latins on several occasions came to close grips with the Romans, and the number of engagements were fought without decisive results. Finally, however, Ancus, by all-out effort, was successful in a pitched battle. He took the town and returned to Rome with an immense quantity of plunder. Once again, thousands more Latins were given Roman citizenship, and made to settle in the quarter where the altar of Murcia stands, thus connecting the Aventine Hill with the Palatine. The Janiculum, too, was brought within the compass of the city, not because the additional area was needed, but as a precaution against its use as a stronghold by some hostile power. It was decided not only to fortify it, but also to facilitate communication with the rest of Rome by building a pile bridge, the first ever to be constructed, across the Tiber. It was Ancus, too, who considerably strengthened the defenses on the more accessible side of the city by the construction of the so-called Quirites Trench. One result of these enormous additions to the population was an increase in certain criminal activities, the dividing line between right and wrong becoming somewhat blurred. To meet this unhappy state of affairs, and to discourage the further growth of lawlessness, the prison was built in the center of the city, just above the Forum. Beyond the city boundaries, Roman territory was also enlarged during Ancus's reign. The Maesian forest was taken from the Veientes, thus extending Roman dominion to the sea. Ostia was founded at the mouth of the Tiber. Salt works were constructed in its neighborhood, and to mark a period of successful military adventure, important additions were made to the temple of Jupiter Feretrius. In the course of this reign, a man named Lucumo left Tarquinii, where he was born, and came to settle in Rome. He was ambitious and wealthy, and hoped to rise to a position of eminence there, such as his native town was never likely to afford him. For though born at Tarquinii, he was by blood an alien, being the son of Demaratus of Corinth. Demaratus had been forced by political troubles to leave his country, and happened to settle in Tarquinii, where he married and had two sons, Lucumo and Arruns. Lucumo survived his father and inherited all his property. Arruns predeceased him, leaving his wife pregnant. Demaratus was unaware that his daughter-in-law was about to have a child, so when shortly afterwards he himself died too, he had made no provision in his will for his grandson. The child, thus deprived of his inheritance, was named Egerius, the needy one. Lucumo, on the contrary, the sole heir of his father's property, became in time as proud as he was wealthy, and his self-confidence was further increased by his marriage to Tanaquil, an aristocratic young woman, who was not of a sort to put up with humbler circumstances in her married life than those she had been previously accustomed to. The Etruscans of Tarquinii despised Lucumo as the son of foreign refugees, and to Tanaquil the indignity of his position soon became intolerable. Wholly bent upon seeing her husband enjoy the respect he deserved, she smothered all feelings of natural affection for her native town, and determined to abandon it forever. For the purpose she had in mind, she decided that the most suitable place was Rome. Rome was a young and rising community. There would be opportunities for an active and courageous man in a place where all advancement came swiftly and depended upon ability. After all, King Tatius had been a foreigner, a Sabine. Numa had been called to the throne from his native Curis. Ancus had had a Sabine mother, and no ancestor of noble blood, with the single exception of Numa. Tanaquil had no difficulty in persuading her husband. He was already set upon improving his position, and the prospect of leaving Tarquinii, the birthplace of his mother only, caused him no distress. So they packed their belongings and left for Rome. The pair had reached Janiculum and were sitting together in their carriage when an eagle dropped gently down and snatched off the cap which Lucomo was wearing. Up went the bird with a great clangor of wings until, a minute later, it swooped down again, and as if it had been sent by heaven for that purpose, neatly replaced the cap on Lucomo's head, and then vanished into the blue. Tanaquil, like most Etruscans, was well skilled in celestial prodigies, and joyfully accepted the omen. Flinging her arms round her husband's neck, she also told him that no fortune was too high to hope for. "Only consider," she cried, "from what quarter of the sky the eagle came, what God sent it as his messenger. Did it not declare its message by coming to your head, the highest part of you? Did it not take the crown, as it were, from a human head, only to restore it, by heaven's approval, where it belongs, thus dreaming upon future greatness?" Lucomo and Tanaquil drove on into Rome, where they bought a house, and Lucomo took the name of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. In Rome, Lucomo soon began to attract attention as a wealthy stranger, and wasted no opportunity in advancing himself. Hospitable, free with his money, and always ready with a kindly word, he made friends rapidly, and it was not long before his reputation got as far as the palace. Once known to the king, he was quick to improve the acquaintance, serving him with such liberality and adroitness that he was soon admitted into intimacy and consulted upon every matter of private interest or national importance, both in peace and war, until he became indispensable, and was even named in the king's will as guardian of his children. Ancus reigned 24 years. His fame as both soldier and administrator was unsurpassed by any previous occupant of the throne. His sons were on the verge of manhood, and for this reason Tarquin, as we shall now call Lucomo, was anxious that the election of a successor to the throne should be held at the earliest possible moment. A date was announced, and a few days before it, Tarquin sent the two boys out of town on a hunting expedition. He is said to have been the first to canvass personally for votes, and to have delivered a public speech designed to win popular support. It was not without precedent. He declared that he, a foreigner, aspired to the throne. Were he the first to do so, there might be surprise or even anger. But he was not the first, but the third. Tatius had been not a foreigner only, but an enemy, and Numa was actually asked to accept the crown when he showed no signs of wanting it, and knew nothing of Rome. Whereas I, Tarquin, continued, so soon as ever I was master of my fortunes, settled amongst you, where with my wife and all my property, and here in Rome, I have spent more years of active public life than in the town where I was born. The laws of Rome, the religion of Rome, I have learned in peace and war, from no negligible teacher. King Ancus himself, I was weighed with all men in my difference, the duty to the king, and not the king himself has surpassed me in generosity to others. Tarquin's claims were not unjustified, and he secured the popular vote by an overwhelming majority. In most ways, he was a man of outstanding character and ability. Nevertheless, after his accession,
He employed the same sort of means of assuring his position as he employed to gain it. He was always something of a schemer, and it was as much to strengthen his own hold upon the throne, as to increase the political influence of the Senate. And he now added to that body 100 new members, subsequently known as representing the lesser families. Owing their promotion to the king, these new members naturally constituted a party of king's men, supporting him in everything. Tarquin's first campaign was against the Latins. He captured Appioli, and returning to Rome with more plunder than what report had held people to expect, he celebrated public games on a scale more elaborate and opulent than any of his predecessors. It was on this occasion that our Circus Maximus was originally planned. On the ground, marked out for its special places, were assigned 2 senators and knights to erect their stands in, or decks as they were called. These stands were supported on props and raised 12 feet from the ground. Horses and boxers, mostly from Etruria, provided the entertainment. From then onward, the games became an annual institution, and were called the Roman or Greek games. Tarquin also made grants of land round the forum to be used as private building sites, and built shops and porticos. His project of enclosing the whole city in a stone wall was, however, interrupted by a clash with the Sabines. The trouble began so unexpectedly that the enemy was across the Anio before Roman troops could make any move to stop him, and there were some moments of acute anxiety. For a while the fighting was indecisive, with heavy losses on both sides. Then the Sabines withdrew, giving Rome a breathing space in which to make fresh preparations. Tarquin seized his chance, and determined to make good what he felt to be the chief weakness of the Roman army, the inadequate number of mounted troops. For this purpose he proposed to reinforce the Ramnes, Titianeses, and Luceres, the centuries originally enrolled by Romulus, with additional formations to be distinguished by his own name. Now Romulus, before acting in this matter, had obtained the sanction of the auguries, and in consequence of this a certain distinguished augur named Attius Navius declared that no change or innovation could possibly be made until the birds had given their consent. Tarquin was very angry. "Ho, ho!" he cried, with contemptuous laugh. "Then I would ask you, holy sir, to declare by your gift of prophecy if what I am thinking of at this moment can be done." His object, the story goes, was to ridicule the whole business of omens, but Navius was unperturbed. He took the auspices, and replied that the thought in the king's mind would indeed be realized. "Very well," said Tarquin. "I was thinking that you would cut a whetstone in half with a razor. Get them, and do what those birds of yours declare can be done." Believe it or not, without a moment's delay, Navius did it. A statue of Navius, with the head covered, once stood on the spot where this occurred, on the steps of the Senate House, on the left-hand side. The whetstone still is supposed to have been preserved here, to remain posterity of the miracle. But whatever we may think of this story, the fact remains that the importance attached to augury and the augural priesthood increased to such an extent that to take the auspices was henceforward an essential preliminary to any serious undertaking in peace or in war. Not only army parades or popular assemblies, but matters of vital concern to the commonwealth were postponed, if the birds refused their assent. Tarquin, on this occasion, made no change in the organization of the centuries of knights, but contented himself with doubling their number, so that the original 3 centuries now contained 18,000 men. The recruits were known as posterior or secondary knights of the 3 centuries: Ramnes, Tites, and Luceres. We speak of the 6 centuries today because of the doubling of the numbers they originally comprised. Hostilities with the Sabines were now resumed. The striking power of Rome had been increased by the expansion of the cavalry, but in what followed it was strategy that played the decisive part. A stack of dry timber which had been lying on the bank of the Anio was set alight, and the blazing logs thrown into the water. A good wind kept them burning, and many were carried down by the stream and became lodged amongst the piles of the bridge, which they set on fire. This was alarming enough for the Sabines while they were fighting, but worse when their resistance broke, for the burning bridge prevented their retreat, and large numbers of them escaped the enemy only to perish in the river. Their equipment floated down the Tiber to Rome, where it was recognized for what it was, and brought the news of victory almost before a messenger could get through. Reports of the engagement say the particular distinction was won by the Roman cavalry. They were posted on the wings, and at a critical moment when the infantry in the center was being forced back, saved the day by a simultaneous charge on both the enemy flanks. Such was the vigor of their assault, that the Sabines were not only checked in their triumphant advance, but compelled to retreat in confusion. A part of the routed army tried to reach the hills. A few men got there, but most of the fugitives, as I have said, were driven by the Roman cavalry into the river. Tarquin decided to press his advantage, having dispatched the plunder and prisoners to Rome, and made as an offering to the god Vulcan a huge bonfire of captured equipment, to be moved forward into Sabine territory. The unfortunate Sabines had no time to think of how best to meet this second threat. Beaten once, they had little hope of success in a further battle. Nevertheless, they took the field with such forces as they could scrape together, and the inevitable result was another defeat. This time was all up with them, and they sued for peace. Colatia and the territory south and west of it were taken from them, and Egerius, the king's nephew, was left to garrison the town. I have read that the formal procedure at the surrender of Colatia was as follows. The king asked, "Are you the accredited representatives of Colatia, sent to surrender yourselves and the people of Colatia?" "We are." "Are the people of Colatia free to make their own decisions?" "Yes." "Do you surrender yourselves and the people of Colatia, together with the town lands, water, boundary stones, shrines, utensils, and all you possess for the service of your gods and of yourselves, into my hands and the hands of the Roman people?" "We do." I received the surrender. The war over, Tarquin made his triumphal entry into Rome. His final campaign was against the ancient Latins. No major battle was fought, and large forces were never engaged. The issue was decided piecemeal. One town after another was attacked and taken. Corniculum, Ficulae, Cameria, Crustumerium, Ameriola, Medulia, Nomentum, all of them settlements either of the ancient Latins or of peoples who had joined their cause. So again, that was Corniculum, Faculia, Cameria, Crustumerium, Ameriola, Medulia, Nomentum. Tarquin's success was complete, and peace was made. However, it was peace with a difference, for the king set his people with such enthusiasm to various civic undertakings that they had even less leisure than they had during the wars. The building of the stone wall, interpreted by the Sabine War, for the protection of those parts of Rome which were as yet unfortified, was resumed. The low-lying areas of the town around the Forum and the valleys between the hills, where flood water usually collected, were drained by sewers leading down into the Tiber. And finally, the foundations of the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline were laid. Tarquin had bound himself during the Sabine War by a solemn vow to build this temple. One cannot but feel that in some way he already foresaw the future splendor of that famous place. In the palace about this time there occurred a very odd thing, which was to have remarkable consequences. A little boy named Servius Tullius was lying asleep when his head burst into flames. Many people saw it happen. The noise and excitement caused by such an extraordinary event came to the ears of the king and queen, and brought them hurrying to the spot. A servant ran for water, and was about to throw it on the flames, when the queen stopped him, declaring so soon as he could make herself heard that the child must on no account be disturbed, but allowed to sleep till he awoke of his own accord. A few minutes later he opened his eyes, and the fire went out. Tanaquil took her husband aside, where they could not be overheard. "Listen," she said. "This child we are bringing up, as if he were no better than a beggar. Believe me, he will one day prove a light in our darkness, a prop to our house in the day of its affliction. We must see that he is taught and tended from now onward with every care, as one through whom will come great glory to our family and to Rome." The story goes that from that instant the child was treated like a prince of the blood and received a prince's education. It was the will of heaven, and all went well. He grew in time to be a man of truly royal nature, and when Tarquin was looking for a son-in-law, he could find no one in Rome comparable in any way to young Servius. So to Servius he betrothed his daughter. However, we may try to account for this singular honor. The fact of it does, at least, make it impossible to believe that either Servius or his mother was ever a slave. There is another, and to me more credible account of the matter, namely that Servius Tullius was prince of Corniculum, and was killed when the town was taken. His wife, who was pregnant at the time of his death, was recognized amongst the other prisoners, and the queen at Rome, as a tribute to her rank, spared her the shame of slavery, and allowed her to live in the palace, where she gave birth to her son. This generous act led to a friendship between the two women, and the little boy, growing up from infancy in the palace, soon made himself beloved, and was generally recognized as a person of importance. The story that he was the child of a slave woman sprang merely from the fact that his unfortunate mother had been a prisoner of war. The respect in which young Servius Tullius was held not only by the king, but by all ranks of Roman society, grew rapidly until he became one of the most distinguished people in the state. About the 38th year of Tarquin's reign, trouble began. The two sons of Tarquin's predecessor, Ancus, had always bitterly resented the trickery by which Tarquin had got them out of the country, when he was their guardian, and robbed them of their rights. It was bad enough, in their view, that a mere immigrant, not even of native Italian blood, should be king of Rome, but the future prospect was more intolerable still. For now, it seemed, even after Tarquin's death, the throne, instead of reverting to them, its rightful heirs, was to sink into the hands of slaves, an abyss indeed. Servius, the slave woman's son, was to possess the power which 100 years before had been enjoyed by Romulus, Romulus the son of a god, and himself divine. If foreigners and slaves could rule in Rome,
while sons of Ancus still lived, it would be not only an insult to the royal blood, but a disgrace to the Roman name. The violence of their resentment suggested a desperate remedy. Only the sword could save Rome from her shame. Tarquin himself, not Servius, was their intended victim, and that for good reasons. First, because the king, if he survived, would have more power to avenge the murder than a subject would have. Secondly, because if Servius were killed, the king would certainly choose some other son-in-law who would ultimately inherit the throne. They laid their plans accordingly to murder the king, and picked two country fellows, both desperate characters, to do the deed. These men, they were shepherds, armed with the rough country tools they were accustomed to use, presented themselves at the entrance court of the palace, where they started brawling, or pretending to brawl, and raised such a racket that all the attendants came crowding round them to see what the matter was. One after the other, the two ruffians appealed to the king at the top of their voices, until their shouts penetrated to the inner rooms, and they were summoned into the king's presence. For a while, they tried to shout each other down, until the king's lictor had had enough of it. He managed to stop them, and told them to say what they had to say one at a time. Then the first, according to the plan, started to put his case, and while the king was listening to him, the other, from behind, split his skull with an axe, leaving the weapon in the wound. Both men then made a dash for the door. Hardly had the dying Tarquin been lifted by his attendants before the fugitives were caught by the lictors. There was an uproar. Excited crowds gathered, eager to know what the trouble was. Tanaquil ordered the palace gates to be closed. Then, getting rid of all who might observe what she was about, she began to prepare remedies for the wound, as if there were still hope of saving the king's life, at the same time taking certain other precautions in case her plan should fail. A few minutes later she sent for Servius. Seizing his hand, she directed his gaze to the king, now at the point of death, and begged him not to leave the murder unavenged, or allow herself to be a creature of contempt in the eyes of those who hated her. "Servius," she cried, "the throne is yours, if you are a man. It shall never be theirs who have done this deed of blood. Rise to your true stature. Follow the gods, who long ago by the circlet of heaven fire declared that your head should wear the crown. Let the memory of those flames, assuredly divine, rouse you to act. Now is the time. Now you must awake indeed. The king and I were foreigners, yet the throne was ours. Forget your origins, and remember only what you are, your manhood." "What? The sudden shock has numbed your wits? What matter? Do as I bid you, and all will be well." Meanwhile the noise and excitement in the street were getting out of hand. The queen hurried to an upper room of the palace, which was near the temple of Jupiter Stator, and flinging open a window which looked out on the new street, began to address the crowd. She urged them to be calm. The king, she declared, had been stunned by a blow. It was a surface wound only. Already he had recovered consciousness. The wound had been cleaned and examined, and there was even reason for confidence. Without any doubt, they would soon see him again for themselves. Meanwhile, she begged them to give their loyal obedience to Servius, who would see justice done in all other ways, deputize for the king. Servius now began to appear in public wearing the white and purple robe of royalty, and preceded by lictors. He sat on the king's seat of justice, listening to suits, some of which he settled out of hand, while others he pretended that he would refer to the king. Thus for a number of days he concealed Tarquin's death, and by making it appear to the public that he was acting merely as the king's deputy, continued in fact to strengthen his own position. Ancus's sons, on the arrest of their hired assassins and the report that Tarquin was alive, and Servius in an almost impregnable position, retired to Suessa Pometia, where they lived in voluntary exile. Servius then proceeded to personal as well as public pressures to strengthen his hold upon the throne. It was not unlikely that Tarquin's sons, Lucius and Arruns, would resent his authority, just as Ancus's sons had resented Tarquin's, so to obviate this danger he married his two daughters to the young princess. But alas, fate is omnipotent, and men are powerless to turn it aside. Nothing Servius could do prevented jealousy of his power from growing, even amongst members of his own household, to such a pitch that the palace was soon a hotbed of intrigue and treachery. A fresh upheaval was, however, most opportunely prevented by a war with the Vaeae, the period of truce having expired, and other Etruscan communities. Servius proved a very able and successful commander. His victory over exceedingly powerful enemy forces was complete, and on his return to Rome there was no reason to doubt the loyalty of any section of society. His possession was assured. It was at this time that he undertook what was by far his most important service to the community, comparable, though in a different sphere, with the work of Numa. Numa had concerned himself with the proper establishment of religion. The political reputation of Servius rests upon his organization of society according to a fixed scale of rank and fortune. He originated the census, a measure of the highest utility to a state destined, as Rome was, to future preeminence, for by means of it public service, in peace as well as in war, could thenceforward be regularly organized on the basis of property. Every man's contribution could be in proportion to its means. The population was divided into classes and centuries, according to the scale based on the census, and suitable for both peace and war. The scale was as follows. 1. Of those whose property was rated at a capital value of 100,000 asses or more, 80 centuries were formed, 40 of seniors, and 40 of juniors. This whole group was known as the first class. The seniors were for civil defense, the juniors for service in the field. All were required to equip themselves with helmet, round shield, greaves, and breastplate. The defensive armor was of bronze. Their weapons of offense were the sword and spear. To this class were attached 2 centuries of engineers, whose duty was the construction and maintenance of the siege engines on active service. They were unarmed. Footnote. The value of the as in the time of Servius cannot be precisely estimated. It is usually taken as rather less than ID of English money. Doubtless, its purchasing power was much greater. End of footnote. Number 2. The second class comprised those whose property was rated between 100,000 and 75,000. From these 20 centuries, senior and junior were formed, and required to provide the same equipment as Class 1, save that the breastplate was omitted and the long substituted for the round shield. The third class, number 3, property rating 50,000, same number of centuries, senior and junior as before, same equipment, but with omission of the greaves. Number 4, the fourth class, rating 25,000, same number of centuries, equipment, spear and javelin only. Number 5, the fifth class, rating 11,000. This class comprised 30, not 20 centuries, equipment, slings and stones. Rated with them were the buglers and trumpeters, 2 centuries. Number 6. Those assessed under 11,000, the remainder of the population, were formed into a single century, exempt from military service. These first 5 classes provided for the equipment of the infantry, graded accordingly to property. There remained the reorganization of the cavalry, or knights. 12 centuries were enrolled, consisting of the most prominent and wealthy citizens. 6 other centuries were also formed. Romulus had formed 3, and called by the old names which had long been consecrated to their use. Each century had a grant from the treasury of 10,000 asses for the purchase of horses, with a further grant levied on rich widows of 2,000 a year for their feeding and maintenance. The poor were thus exempted from contributions, and all financial burdens were shifted onto the shoulders of the rich. The latter were then compensated by political privilege, manhood suffrage with equal rights for all, which had obtained ever since the days of Romulus, was abolished and replaced by a sliding scale. This had the effect of giving every man nominally a vote, while leaving all power actually in the hands of the knights and the first class. The procedure, when a vote was required, was to call first upon the knights, then upon the 80 centuries of the first class. In the rare case of disagreement, the second class was then asked to vote. That in general proved sufficient, and it was hardly ever necessary to go forward, certainly not as far as the lowest orders. The fact that the present organization, as it exists since the increase in the number of the tribes to 35 and the doubling of their members by the junior and senior centuries, does not correspond to the total established by Servius Tullius, need cause no surprise. Servius divided the city, taking in the built-over hills, into 4 regions, which he named tribes, a word derived, I suppose, from tribute. For it was also planned by Servius to have the contribution of each citizen fairly apportioned on the basis of the census. These tribes bore no relation to the number or distribution of the centuries. To expedite the completion of the census, a law was passed punishing with imprisonment or death all who failed to register. Thereupon the king issued a proclamation that all Roman citizens of all classes should present themselves by centuries in the Campus Martius at daybreak. There, with the sacrifice of a pig, a sheep, and an ox, the act of lustral purification was performed, the ceremony being termed the lustral close, as the final act of the whole business of the census. On that first occasion, 80,000 names were said to have been registered, according to Fabius Pictor, our oldest authority. That was the number of men capable of bearing arms. The population of Rome was by now so great that Servius decided to extend the city boundaries. He took in, accordingly, 2 more hills, the Quirinal and the Viminal, and subsequently added to the area of the Esquiline, which he had made fashionable by residing in the quarter himself. The city defenses he strengthened by constructing trenches, earthworks, and a wall. This involved extending the Pomerium, a term which needs some comment. By derivation, the word is taken to mean the strip of ground behind the wall. More properly, however, it signifies the strip on both sides of the wall. This ground the ancient Etruscans used to concentrate with augural ceremonies when a new town was to be founded. It was a narrow strip, precisely defined in width and following the course which the town wall would follow when it was built. Its purpose was to keep the walls on their inner side clear of all buildings, which nowadays are, as a rule, actually joined to them, and at the same time to leave on the outer side of the walls an area unpolluted by the use of man. The whole strip, then, which it was felt to be impious to build over on one side or to cultivate on the other, was called pomerium by the Romans, such as much because the walls were behind it, as because it was behind the walls. Whenever, with the growth of the city, it was proposed to increase the area enclosed within the walls, this strip of consecrated ground was pushed outward accordingly. Rome was now in a highly flourishing condition. The size of the city had been increased. Internal affairs were satisfactorily settled to meet all demands both in peace and war. In these circumstances, the king devised a project which he hoped would serve the double purpose of adding something to the architectural splendor of the city, and of extending her influence without the perpetual recourse to arms. By the time of which we are speaking, the temple of Diana in Ephesus was already famous, and report had it that the building had been erected as a joint enterprise of the Asian communities. Servius deliberately cultivated personal friendship with the Latin nobles and good public relations with their country, and then began, whenever opportunity offered, to praise in their presence, in glowing terms, the harmony of feeling and unity of worship amongst the townships of Asia, until by continually harping upon the same theme, he at last carried his point, and a temple of Diana was built in Rome by the Latin peoples in association with the Romans. This was an admission that the long struggle for supremacy was over. Rome, by common consent, was the capital city. The Latins indeed had been defeated so often in this struggle that they had apparently ceased to concern themselves with it. There was, however, one man, a Sabine, who saw, or thought he saw, a chance of recovering power without involving his country in war. On one of the farms in the Sabine country there was a heifer of astonishing size and beauty, a truly marvelous creature, remembered for many subsequent generations by its horns, which were hung in the vestibule of the temple of Diana. It was acquired, very properly, a certain numinous value, as if it were hardly of this earth, and prophecies were made to the effect that imperial power would belong to the nation whose citizens offered it in sacrifice to Diana. This prediction came to the knowledge of the temple priest. "Stranger," he said, "what can you be thinking of? Surely you do not mean to sacrifice to Diana without first performing the act of purification. You must bathe yourself, before the ceremony, in a living stream. Down there in the valley the Tiber flows." The stranger was a religious man, and the warning went home. Unwilling to admit any part of the proper ritual, lest the event should fail to correspond with the prophecy, he hurried down to the river. During his absence, the Roman priest sacrificed the heifer himself. All Rome, including the king, was delighted. There was no doubt that by this time Servius had a definite prescriptive right to the throne. Nonetheless, he determined still further to strengthen his position. Young Tarquin was spreading malignant gossip about his never having received the popular vote, and Servius was well aware of what he was saying. Accordingly, to conciliate the good will of the commons, he first distributed land captured in war amongst private holders, and then took the bold step of demanding the people's vote upon the title to the throne. He was declared king by an overwhelming and unprecedented majority. Tarquin was undismayed by Servius's success. Indeed, his hopes of gaining the throne burned more hotly than before. One reason for this was that he knew that the distribution of land had been disapproved by the Senate, a fact which would enable him to vilify Servius and increase his own influence in that body. Another was his own character, for he was by nature ambitious, and his wife, Tullia, was not of the sort to let his ambition sleep. In ancient Greece, more than the royal house was guilty of crime, which became the stuff of tragedy. Now Rome was to follow that same path, but not in vain, for that very guilt was to hasten the coming of liberty and the hatred of kings, and to ensure that the throne it won should never again be occupied.